Back to the Always in Pursuit podcast. This is Aaron. I am kind of your host. I am back in the chair this week. It's good to be with you all. As always, I am joined by Pastor Mark and Pastor Megan. Hey guys.
What's happening? How was Utah?
Southwest Utah was excellent.
Was a lot of Mormons.
I mean, there were a couple times where you would, like in Walmart, you would see like women in like head to toe dresses with like the bonnet things on.
Look like Amish homeschoolers.
Something, yeah.
I love that every time you say it, you're very specific in Southwest Utah.
Yeah.
Like you don't say you went to Utah, you went to Southwest
Sorry.
Utah.
It's a big state. That'd be like, I went to Minnesota in Minneapolis. No, you didn't experience it. It's
Just okay.
yeah. Utah
I'm
has
glad
many
you
different
enjoyed
corners.
Southwest Utah.
Yeah.
You went from you went to the bastion of conservatism. That's not the South. It's not the Southern
Is it
conservatism.
really?
Oh, Utah is like the most conservative voting state.
Really?
Yeah, like maybe out of every state.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's interesting.
It's a very homogenous group of people. That's what I'm saying. The Mormons basically just own the state.
I mean, I guess that makes sense
Yeah.
now that I think about it. So a couple funny observations about Utah. We did not have to dwell in this space for very long. First one was, I mean, there's so many Mormon like temples.
Yeah.
I was like, are there any Christian churches in this state? So we're driving around, and like right when I said that to my father-in-law, we drove past a Baptist church, and then like a block down the same street there was a Lutheran church.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, okay, they do exist. So then the second observation was, we wanted to have margaritas one night. So I was trying to find a liquor store, and their liquor stores are closed on Sundays. So it just sent me like 10 years in the past, Minnesota, like PTSD.
Yep.
10
Blue-
years has
blue
it been
laws.
that long?
I think it's been longer actually. And then the second part of that is that all of the liquor stores in Utah are state run and operated.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
That's actually brilliant.
It is.
All the tax base goes straight to
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was talking to like the person who's checking me out with my margarita mix and tequila, and she was like, "Yep, that's how Utah rolls. That's how we get a lot of our like revenue for the state." And then she goes, "But it's kind of bad too because they don't really care about what we carry, and our selection sucks." And I was like, "Well, I'm just gonna go make some margaritas for my family now." So.
You're like, I wonder how many Mormons work in the liquor store. Probably not seen as a
Probably
great
not
job
many.
for
Yeah.
Mormons.
If you're any type of liquor connoisseur, which I am not really, like,
Southwest Utah is not the place to be.
I think Utah in general is not the place to
I
go.
barely drink.
Alright.
I've like the same couple bottles of liquor that I've had for like the last 10 years in my
Yeah, so it was a
We
great
have
trip.
a lot that we want to cover today.
We do. It was a great trip. Glad to be
Megan's
back.
like, stop talking about Mormons, stop talking about liquor.
Yeah.
You're smart. That's
Yeah.
good.
So it's good to be back. Yeah, rested. Got some good sun. Vitamin D is great. So, but I missed you all too much to stay away for too long.
Aww.
Yeah, we do have a lot to talk about today.
We all know that's not true.
Hey,
Just had to go back to work.
I
You had to come
did.
back. The
I,
kids
lo-
at
I
school.
love, I love his
Miss you
rebuttal.
guys.
Hey,
you
but
can't say that. That's not fair.
all right, what are we doing today?
I did. You're going to review your message.
Yeah,
from this past
we'll do that
Sunday.
quick because we got some other stuff to talk about.
Yeah. We'll just jump into all that stuff after you review.
Before we jump into that, I just wanted to make a quick comment on a remark that Mark had made to me after last week's podcast.
Because I'm a psycho and listen to the podcast after we.
Yeah, all the time. He just listens to it on repeat. No, you came in on Friday and you were like, in the podcast on Wednesday, we did a lot of like somewhere in the Bible it says, or like scriptures say, and didn't actually dig through and say references and find where it says that. So we just want to be intentional for you guys to take that moment, stop, look on our computers because we have technology, and find that scripture and be better about referencing where things are.
Yeah, my
Yes.
brain was not on. I couldn't even think of the word Ecclesiastes. Like,
Yeah.
I got a text from Caitlin. She was like, she just literally the text was like, "Hey, listen to the podcast, Ecclesiastes. You found it eventually. Great
Yeah.
podcast." So
Yeah.
it was pretty fun.
So we were a little tired last week, but we're gonna continue to get better at this whole podcast thing.
Yeah, I think I
and-
was still in a drug fog from the surgery, so I think I'm feeling much better today.
All right.
So far we've talked about liquor and drug fun.
Yeah, there we go.
This is great.
Welcome
Awesome.
to Pursuit
It's
Community.
only gonna get better.
Always in pursuit of. Yep.
Yeah.
So-
Jesus.
Jesus,
Yep,
yes,
okay.
always in pursuit of Jesus. You are correct. So your sermon this weekend, Voice of Truth.
Yes, I would also like to say one more thing.
Yep.
My daughter started listening to our podcast. We got home the other day and she's like, Dad, can I go finish episode 18? Sure.
She might be the only one who knows what episode it
Knock
is.
yourself out.
We have 18 episodes.
There you go.
Wow.
Today's 19, I believe.
Thanks, Mace. Love you.
So
Dang.
if Macy, if you're listening to this, you're the best 7-year-old that ever existed.
Macy, if you're listening to this, earmuffs.
Well done. Okay. So no, Daddy was not in a drug fog. So here we go. So this week I gave a little bit of an overview, talking more about the sort of three things that John cycles through. You know, the theology, do you believe the right thing? The morality, are you living it? Are you actually like putting it into practice? And the relational sort of communal test of like, do you love one another?
Mm-hmm.
Pretty much same thing over and over and over again.
Yeah.
If you like ever have a test where they're like, hey, what does John talk about? You can answer the question pretty easily.
Yeah.
There you
Like,
go.
he's just like, hey, do I believe the right thing? Am I living the right life? Are we loving each other? That's the main thing. So, and then I mentioned that kind of like his cycle, you know, seemed to be his style of preaching, which I thought was pretty cool. And, you know, I got a little nerdy on that, looking at some of the different styles of different. The problem is we don't have a lot of sermons. We have a lot of letters.
That makes First John unique.
Right.
I
So
enjoy that.
I kind of enjoyed that. I got to kind of make those, you know, because I think for us, there's a very common sermon structure that gets used today.
Mhm.
And it's way different than what he was doing.
Yeah.
He was just like pounding the 1 point home.
Yeah, I think one of the main differences is that, like, you know, using like a Paul letter, for example, it's very personal because it's usually written to like one person or a small group of people. This example with John in First John, it's a sermon. Like, he wrote it to be for like a larger audience.
Yep.
Which is why he doesn't mention names specifically. He says dear children, which is very broad, unspecific. Like, yeah, it's written in a way that is to be communicated and not just like consumed personally, if that makes sense.
Well, and Paul calls out specific people a couple times, like, hey, this guy's a false teacher, don't listen to him. John doesn't do that because it's going to different contexts, different groups of people. They're hearing from different people. Like, he can't, you know, he can't personalize it. It's meant to be cyclical. It's also cyclical. We call it a cyclical letter or cyclical sermon because it goes throughout the churches in the area and kind of makes its way through. So, you know, pretty straightforward the way that he's like hammering home the main thing. And if you're going to really hammer home the main thing, it's God is love is the main idea. And then it's what's your response to that. Those three things that he was talking about are all, hey, do you believe it? Hey, are you living it? Hey, is it showing itself in your community? And then he spent a lot of time kind of defending having the right Christology. So basically what you believe about Jesus, making sure that you're on the right footing for what you believe about Jesus. And I still think this is one of the most important things. I mean, I kind of hammered home a couple of the things that I think are huge problems for us today, where, you know, I think he's hammering home that Jesus came in the flesh because that's in direct response to their problems, right? But I think for us, you know, the things that we kind of are running into are much more of the supremacy of Christ, the substitutionary atonement of Jesus going to the cross for us. And to just give you what substitutionary atonement means, it's literally the process of Jesus taking on the sins of everyone on the cross. He substituted himself and he brought atonement. He brought forgiveness of sin into the world for all of us. And there are people who are questioning all of those things. They're questioning his supremacy. They're questioning the substitutionary atonement. And then the last one I had on there was exclusivity, that he's the only way. Those three things are highly debated. That's where Jesus gets eroded in our culture. He got eroded there by saying, no, he didn't come in flesh. He was just spirit. Spirit can't die. So he didn't actually die. And so, you know, here, I think the conversation is actually the ones that I'm having quite a bit with people are much more on an intellectual level and much more of like a thought experiment. And they start with this idea of like, well, I believe this to be true. And so if this is true, then it must mean this about God. So like, this is the way the thought process goes. Like, I think God should, you know, forgive without having to have any blood to pay for sin. That seems archaic to me. I believe God shouldn't have to punish somebody and pour out his wrath on them, because that wouldn't make him very good. So I believe that the best way for this to happen wouldn't be substitutionary atonement. And you're like, okay, but that's you started with the premise of like, this is where I think God should be like, and then work towards how this should all
What
work.
is true. Yeah.
And it's like, no, it starts with here's what happened.
Yeah. It starts with the truth, and then you form your beliefs around that.
Right. You take Jesus at his word,
Yeah.
and you decide that he is historically who the Bible said he is, and he did the things that historically were said about him. And then you process what you think God should be like based on what is the reality.
Yep.
So like, that's the hard part. And I think a lot of people are just kind of flipping that around.
You just described like the conversion process of like, this is how you become a Christian, you know?
Right.
But it's funny, listening to the sermon this weekend, the impression I had was, it's so ironic that like people get this backwards who are already call themselves Christians. Like, you shouldn't just say you're a Christian and then try and change who God is. Like, it's all about understanding who God is, who Jesus is, what he came to do. And then you make a decision. Either you believe it or you don't. Like, either you're a Christ follower or you don't. That's what's so like, we say it in the church world all the time. Like, we shouldn't have to keep telling you guys this because this is pretty basic. And it's essentially what Paul's saying. It's just what John's saying. It's what all of these first church leaders were saying is
James.
Like, hey guys, you were with Jesus. You should know like how this works. And then they act like they don't. So
right. And it often is, it starts as like a thought exercise, and it starts as like let me read the viewpoint of somebody who's brilliant, right? And has this other kind of theology built. And what's funny is that all the theology that's out there right now that people are like rediscovering, and I always bash Richard Rohr for this, he's my example of a theologian who just drives me crazy. Like, I think he means well, but it's that none of this stuff is new. It's just repackaged. So like, some of the heretical ideas that are now being floated out there are just things that were decided to be heretical, hundreds of years ago and put aside, and they've been picked back up like shiny new objects. Yeah. And now they're being repackaged to people. And you're like, the point of all of this is to erode historically who Jesus is. Like, we can have Jesus or we can choose not to. But what we can't have is this like neutered version of Jesus where we like created him in our own image to be exactly who we want him to be. That's what's really kind of frustrating about this whole process, is that I can see very clearly, like, you're creating Jesus to be who you want him to be. But like, people are like, no, I'm just, like, this is a revolutionary idea that's going to, and I'm just like, it's not revolutionary. It's a few hundred years old. Yeah. The church has already rejected it outright.
There was like a church council about this like 1,000 years ago.
Like, none of this is new. It's been regurgitated a few times throughout history. Yeah. It's always been knocked down. We're still in the same place that we were at, and again, this goes back to, if you think you have a new idea now,
there's nothing new.
It's wrong. Like, we have 2,000 years of church history. Like, you're not the first person to think.
You're like, this thing that you're talking about wrestling with, this is why this denomination split.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Right. There are a group of people that still. Yeah. It was my friend in college. He had I can't think of the name of the denomination that he was in. It's very small Baptist offshoot, and the only difference that they had was that they just believed in annihilationism. So essentially, like, they believed that people just didn't live forever in hell, that you just went to hell and you died. Like, you went to hell and you burned up. And so we used to have these like 3-hour arguments, throwing scripture back and forth and trying to like argue each other off and he's still at the church. He's still in the denomination. Like, it probably doesn't really matter whether you think it's eternal damnation or just damnation. Like, like, what's the difference? I guess one is just hurts longer. Like, either way, I'm not really sure it matters.
I think I've told this story before. It's very brief. At a previous church I worked at in youth ministry, I taught confirmation for 4 years. And in one of the confirmation classes, talking about church history, I had this like giant whiteboard that was like, took up one whole wall of the room. And I took like 3 or 4 hours and using dry erase markers, wrote out like the denominational tree of all, like pretty much all the denominations, not all of them, but like all the major ones, and then wrote in like dates and reasons for like why the branches split, the denomination split. And so like the students were like really taking.
Why did the Southern Baptist split? What happened there?
I don't remember, honestly. Like,
Such a nerdy thing to do. I love it.
but it was like the students were like, why did they all split? And I was like, because they got really hung up on like a certain issue or a certain thing, or there was some sort of like catalyst moment that caused a split. And they're like, it's really sad. And I was like, well, yeah, probably, but like, you know, God has really created this like beautiful mosaic of churches for some reason. You know, it's part of his plan. Like, you know, he wants his church to be diverse. So but it is just, it's really interesting to like look at this crazy history family tree of all these churches and denominations and think like every time a branch splits, it's because of some sort of conflict, disagreement, argument, issue. Like,
yeah, my favorite one is the Evangelical Free Church and the Converge, which is what we're part of, which originally was Swedish Baptist. Just run that through. Swedish chef and Baptist put together. It's perfect. And the reason they split was like a very small governance issue, and they split very happily, and we're very happy to run just essentially parallel within the universe of churches, just like Swedes would, like perfectly happy.
We don't do conflict.
Yeah, like oh, you guys want to do that? Okay, well, go and have a good life. You know, like
you're on that side of the street, we're on this side of the street.
Yeah, it's just really funny, and they're basically the same denomination today. Like, there's really not a lot of difference. You know, I think Converge is a little bit more, allows for a little bit more local leadership at the church level. They don't have a lot of top-down leadership, and even Evangelical Free has a little bit more denominational control. This is literally the difference. Like, theologically, they're like exactly the same.
Yeah,
I think there might be a little bit of difference today on women in ministry between the two, but another whatever bad reason to split a denomination. And by the way, any of these things we mentioned, substitutionary atonement, exclusivity of Christ, I forget what the first one I said was, it was right there in my head. Supremacy of Jesus. We could do a whole podcast on these things. Yeah, we could even talk about denominations. I don't know what people are interested in, but if there's something that strikes you as somebody, you know, who listens to this podcast, and you want us to do something, we could certainly talk much longer about this kind of stuff. I'm a nerd, so I like all of it. You may not be interested in any of it. So yeah, but what you believe about Jesus still is one of the most important things about being a Christ follower, understanding exactly who he is, what he did, how it happened, the whole thing, and not sort of kind of eroding the truth about who Christ is, because it comes in like waves, and it comes in small things, and then eventually Jesus gets kind of far away from who he was. And that, I think that's a little bit of what we have. I know, like, culturally there's been sort of critiques of that, you know, the buddy Jesus, like we've turned him into this like cartoonist,
just like a good guy.
Yeah, it's almost like a version that sells better, you know what I mean, like a consumeristic version of Jesus,
more palatable.
It's not so much like a hippie Jesus, it's more of like he embodies just virtues and morals, and not like, it's not about the actions of Christ, what he came to do. It's more about like what he represents, if that makes sense. Like, which it can be, you know, we talk a lot about love and a lot about acceptance and, you know, things like that. And those are all good things. So that's part of what Jesus came to do.
But most of the time when we talk about love, it's not actually biblical, the way Jesus loved people. Yeah. It's very 100%. Flowery and very like,
a lot of times it's lust.
It's great.
A lot of times it's romance.
Yeah.
A lot of times it's
like
self-serving,
meaning that you can't be angry or like have conflict. You just have to be like passive.
Can't have boundaries.
Yeah.
Can't.
None of those things are love.
Yeah, no way. And I mean, John's definition of love is really just action. It's like it's self-sacrificing action.
Yeah.
So, and I think then we moved on to just the idea that like when we're applying this, I feel this way, and this just came out of my own small group. So sorry to throw you guys under the bus. I love you guys. They're all great. My whole small group is great. But like we spent a little while talking about like how do we deal with homeless people on the street corner. When in reality, I think what John is saying here is not what's your plan to deal with homeless people that you encounter. It's actually like, how do you love the people that are hardest for you to love, the ones closest to you?
Yeah.
Like in your church, the one that you don't really want to bump into at church.
Yep.
The one that's in your family that drives you crazy. The one in your extended family that you can't stand at the next family gathering. You might avoid the family gathering if so-and-so is going to be there. Like, that's who John's talking about.
Yeah. It's that person who, when somebody asks who's the hardest to love, they like pop up into your head and you go, nope, and like push it aside and think about the next person.
Because they don't deserve it.
Yeah.
Because they're super annoying.
Yep.
Because you don't have the time and you've tried.
Yep.
And you're like, if you're going to think about how John's talking here, like, that's you.
Who's that first person?
Yeah, Jesus did that for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're super annoying.
Well, and I think as Christians too, one of the traps is that like we tend to like avoid those hard to love people so that we can just focus on like the homeless person or something.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
'Cause that's really easy.
Yeah.
You walk away, you have no connection with them after.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like,
Feel good about
I
yourself.
did that. I feel good about it. It's more self-serving than it is actually like,
And I am not saying don't do that, by the way.
yeah. And I think if John were here, what he would say is like, yeah, I want you to love that homeless person, but you can't do that unless you first do this.
Right.
Like you got to love like Jesus loved.
Yeah,
I mean,
the hard
this
people.
could rabbit trail into missions and how detrimental short-term mission trips can be.
Yeah.
I could talk on that for a long time.
I was just thinking about my friend who went to plant a church in Nashville. I was like, get out of here. Why are you planting a church in Nashville? You got about 16 churches per block down there. Like, it's the most church city in the entire country. Like, why don't you go plant a church in New England? Yeah, well, or I know friends that were missionaries to the Mormons. It's like, what are we doing here?
Southwest Utah.
Yeah, it's just a weird thing. I'm not saying that's wrong or bad.
No.
Yeah, you go plant your church, fine. You go
Yeah.
do your mission that you feel called to. And even for us, like, let's have a plan for how you're going to handle that person at the corner.
Yeah.
If you feel
Yeah, we're not
compelled.
saying ignore homeless people. That
Really, I know a couple families that do like they have packs of things in their car. They have stuff packed in
Care
there.
packs, yep.
Yeah, like a pair of socks, like some like, I don't know, shampoo and stuff.
yeah, hygiene stuff.
Yeah, then they've got like some power bars and stuff, and they just hand those things out, and they hand a gift card in there for like Chick-fil-A or something. Hand that out. It's like,
Yeah.
Okay, that's a really great idea. Like,
Yep.
you've done something important in that moment.
Yeah.
Not what we're talking about here.
No.
And after I had lunch with our family and another family, and we were just talking through processing the sermon together, and it was said, at the table, like, I know I hate this sermon series. I hate you. I know exactly who I'm supposed to love, and I don't want to do it.
Yeah.
Stop doing this.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, so I was like,
It's that first person
yes.
that you're like, too hard. I've tried before. It hasn't worked. It's going to be too messy. Not going there.
Yeah.
I'm out.
I'm not going to keep dumping effort down this black hole.
Yeah.
Plus, this is going to hurt me.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I'm not telling you to get abused. I'm not telling you to not have good boundaries. Please hear me when I say this. But there are people in our lives, they don't deserve our love. They don't deserve our acceptance. And yet we're called to go out and love them and accept them and find a way. And it can be a situation like Jesus going to the cross. Like, it can be a situation where they don't deserve it, and there isn't anything we can get in return out of it. And yet we're still called to go for it.
Yep.
And you think there must have been some problems in those churches with, I don't know if is disunity the word, like, there must have been some issues around unity in the churches that he was writing to.
Well, like when I did my sermon 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, whatever it was, when I was reading about that passage, and doing like the overview of First John itself, it was saying that John never mentions what the conflict was, but there was some sort of crisis among those churches. Something happened, and a group of people took off. And then they came back and were trying to like stir things up again and create more disunity and more conflict. And that's, when John talks about like the spirit of the Antichrist, he's talking about that group of people who are trying to like tear down the church from the outside because they used to be on the inside and they should know better because they know Christ. Right? They should know Christ. And so like that's kind of where that notion comes from of like, we got to love like Christ loved, because that's what unifies, and be accepting.
Which is funny. I mean, he definitely calls them the Antichrist, and he definitely is telling the people in the church, like, hey, you guys bind together. Like, stop having conflict between you guys, because there is conflict coming from outside.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Right. Like, so the conflict on the inside needs to be figured out. So that way the conflict on the outside is the only conflict you have to deal with.
Yeah.
There's no way that you can have a unified front
Yeah.
if you all hate each other.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It's not going to work.
Well, and one thing I want to mention too, like when we talk about like the Antichrist, I think we oftentimes take like the Revelation view of the Antichrist. Like there is this figure coming at some point in the future who is going to be like the end boss at the end of the video game, who's going to be really bad and want to destroy everything. And yeah, whatever. When we're talking about the Antichrist here, we're saying that these people were acting the opposite of Jesus.
Right.
They were the
the
antithesis.
spirit of the Antichrist is
That's
one
right.
point he says.
So it's not so much like, the devil coming, or, I feel like in our culture, we like to be like, well, Trump's the Antichrist, Biden's the Antichrist, or something, it's
Trudeau,
like, yeah.
Fill in the blank.
somebody
There
from
are
Europe,
5
Right.
billion
Putin,
names.
I don't know. Like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
go back further. I feel like everybody was always the Antichrist every 3 years. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
any world leader, like, oh, there's the Antichrist. Well,
yeah. Or like if
oh,
you
new
have,
leader in China, that's the guy. Like,
if you have witches in your church,
Oh.
but so like,
that's an inside joke.
so
by the
don't
way.
get caught up on that when you're reading First John. When you read Antichrist, that phrase, like, it's not talking about like the end times Antichrist. It's like he could like interchange that with these people are acting like the opposite of Jesus.
Yep.
That's what he's saying.
Yep.
Like,
Yep. Which I think people get all excited when they hear, "Ooh, Antichrist! Ooh, we're gonna
Yeah.
talk about end times."
It's a trigger word.
I just so you know, guys, like, probably gonna not really preach about that very often because I could care less. You know what Revelation's about? We win.
yeah.
The end
It's
is
great.
great. The end is fantastic.
Yeah.
Do I think we need to be like looking for all the signs, and like, if your life changes because you need something to like look for all the signs, and you're going to live
Mhm.
differently now because things are in the different time frame, you've already missed it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, Jesus talks about living to be ready for tomorrow to be the day.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Yeah.
having
Yeah.
the oil in the lamp so that when the Son of God comes back, you're ready to say, I did it. I did what I was supposed to do. I'm
Mhm.
ready for you. And if you need something else to give you motivation to share your faith or to live on mission or to like whatever, like, you need some sort of idea that the time is short. It's short. Every one of these writers in the New Testament wrote as if it was going to be in their lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so we're supposed to live that way and
Yeah.
act that way.
Mhm.
You don't need revelation
Yeah.
to get there.
Yeah.
And by the way, really the main thing is like, God is supreme. It gets all reconciled. We win. Jesus is sitting on the throne next to, to the right hand of God. Like, that's the end. That's how it
Yeah.
works. Like,
Mhm.
do we need to worry about
The really trippy imagery?
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's like, was that a tank that he just talked about there? Like,
no, it was
Yeah.
a helicopter for sure.
I think that's
right.
It's an
The dragonfly. Yeah.
It's an easy way for our focus to come off of the mission of Christ and focus on other things. And whenever that happens, it's just never good.
Right.
Like the church
Yeah.
splinters, denominations splinter.
Small group splinter.
Yeah, like people's personal faith splinter because they took their eyes off of the actual mission that Christ gave us
Mhm.
and we're focused on something else.
So, I mean, that was kind of the main idea. I mean, kind of landing on this, God is love is essentially where John,
Mhm.
the key verse in chapter 4, and kind of the key phrase for the entire book, the key idea that's all there. It's like, if you're going to believe the right thing about God, if you're going to live the way that God's called you to live, then it should show up in your community. It's essentially the main concept of what he's been writing about. And then we've got one more chapter, which is split into 2 the next couple weeks. So I think I'm just doing like 12 verses next week, and then the rest, which are I think 13 or 14 verses.
So
the next
it'll
week.
only be like 45 minutes.
I'm gonna go for 40, maybe 35 this week. I'm gonna try. I had 2
You're-
really long passages in this that like really were tough.
If you hit 35, Mark, I mean, you're solidly in Aaron Lynch territory. But
Yeah.
like that, there would have to be some sort of a trophy or an award.
I-
at the end of that.
So what's crazy is that when I preached at Grace, like, they were maniacal about me hitting 35, and I
Yeah.
did every time I preached.
Mhm.
And I hated that so much that now I rebel against it. But I think I could settle into, I think 40 is my like perfect, 40 to 42 is like my perfect amount of time.
It keeps
And-
every time we talk, it creeps up. It's 40. Oh, it's 14. Yeah, maybe 44. Yeah, I think 48's my wheelhouse. Like,
I don't know. Anyways,
All right.
so that's where we're at. That's a review of the sermon. I hope you go listen to it.
Yeah.
Sermon
I
questions
had
are
one
up.
person text me. It's so funny because like there'll be weeks where I'm like, well, that was the worst sermon I've ever preached. And then other weeks where I'm like, well, that was great. That really was awesome. And then other weeks where I'm like, well, that was just like normal, like average, and I swear every time I like think best sermon I've ever preached, I get somebody who like is like, hey man, maybe a little long, or every time I think I've like preached the worst sermon in my life, someone will text me, that's the best sermon I've ever heard you preach. Thank you so much. That was amazing. You spoke right to me. And I'm just like, it's
maybe the Holy Spirit bringing in a little humility or a little building you up when you're too down.
yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
I think it's just leaving room for the Holy Spirit to fill in some of those gaps. I mean, I think we've all probably had experiences like that where like, for me, it's always traditionally been like in youth ministry where like the nights where I had a great plan, everything was super prepared, had the volunteer team humming. Those are the nights where you're like, oh, that didn't work the way I thought it was going to. And the nights where like, you go into a youth group and you're like, well, something came up. I didn't have time to prepare.
Just going to wing it.
5 thoughts.
Yeah, we're just going to wing it tonight. Those would be like nights where, like we're outside baptizing kids and, on the stream or something. And you're like, this is the best. Like, oh, God's great. And you're like, oh.
Because it's not in our power.
That's right. Because it's not up to us. And we've all known people who are like, well, I'm just going to do that every week, not prepare and let the Holy Spirit do it. And you're like, no, that's not how this works.
The Holy Spirit also works in preparation.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Anyways, it was one of those weeks where I was like, I don't know, a little long. Could have cut that one back a little bit. And then someone texted me, this is the best sermon I've ever heard you preach. This is best. I'm like, okay. Well,
it's probably a kids ministry volunteer.
I pretty much asked my wife and she just tells me straightforwardly, like, no, that was dog crap. Like, oh, that was great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, no, you probably should have prepared a little better for that one. Like, I could tell you were winging it in the last half of that sermon.
Yeah. Oh. So we actually wanted to take some time in this podcast to pivot slightly and go back. If you've been listening to this podcast for a while now, we started a conversation last fall around fall kickoff. We had a sermon series called Here for Good that was like 8 or 9 weeks, something like that. And we were talking basically, I mean, Mark, you can kind of dive into this because it was your sermon series. Yep. But basically the idea was like, what actually are we doing here as a church? Not just like Pursuit as an individual church, but like the Big C church, Christianity as a whole. And we really had been sensing for a variety of reasons that there were just some things kind of coming to a head within Christianity as far as issues. There were like some scandals and abuses that were coming into light at some pretty, big churches and well-known Christian leaders and teachers and authors, things like that. And so we took that as an opportunity to talk about what is the purpose of the church? Why are we here? What are we doing? And it was really more of a call to get back to the original mission, and not to say that like we as Pursuit are far off from that, but we're just more taking some time to be critical of ourselves as Christians, as Christ followers, but also to assess where we're at as a church and what we actually need to be focusing on.
Yep.
So we want to take some time today to kind of follow up on that conversation that we started in the fall for 9 weeks and kind of talk a little bit more about that because there's been some other things that have kind of come up within.
There's been a few catalysts that have pushed this conversation to the forefront.
Yeah.
I want to go back for a second and say that the three of us for sure, and probably everybody in ministry who's been long enough has had some pain in working in the church in some way. It's kind of inevitable, even from my perspective, it's like, I'm trying to lead this church in a way that will create no pain. I want to do no harm. I mean, like the physician who takes the Hippocratic oath, like to do no harm. Like, I feel like pastors need to be thinking about that.
Yeah.
But I think it goes both ways too. Like I was listening to a guy who, had a terrible experience as a pastor at his church. And he was asking the question, like, I've heard a lot of people who've left churches and talked about how the church hurt them. What I have never heard is like somebody who said, yeah, I was part of an elder board and I hurt the pastor who left. You know what I mean? Like, like there's a lot of burnt out pastors who are on the other end of that too.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of baggage. I think I have some baggage, like coming out of what became a pretty dysfunctional situation. And one of the reasons that we planted this church was to fix in my mind, fix some of those problems.
Yeah.
And it could have been a little reactionary. It's even me questioning my motives from time to time. Like, are we doing this because we really believe in transparency? Or are we doing this because we just never saw transparency anywhere in the church? Like, are we doing this because we were hurt by the fact that there wasn't are these altruistic motives, or am I responding or reacting to something? So I'm always kind of questioning that, and I'm always a little uneasy, and I do feel this way. I'm kind of, like, I'm not convinced I'll ever pastor anywhere else other than here. Like, I've been thinking about that lately. Like, this is like, if the church can be what I think it can be, then I'm going to be happy being the pastor here. And if the church can't be what I think it can be, then I'm probably just going to like sell insurance. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know how that sounds, but like, I think a lot of us who've been in ministry long enough, we're like still hanging in, trying to hope the church will get where it needs to go. And then we still see the potential in it, and we still see the hope that it brings to the world and the change that it can bring to the world. And we still want to invest in it, but we're trying to create something that doesn't look like what we came out of or were hurt by or the crap that we've dealt with. And we could do many podcasts, and we have done a few of talking about some of that.
Yeah.
And so we were kind of talking this through, and I was like, as I was thinking about these new allegations or things that are coming up, which we'll talk about in a second, and some of the stuff that was last generation, and this is the Bill Hybels and the Ravi Zachariases and the James McDonalds and the, if you don't know who these people are, they're just high profile pastors who were just total hypocrites, who like did one thing and said one thing and, hurt people and damaged stuff. And it's like, to process all that is, you can see the amount of damage it's done to the kingdom and the amount of damage it's done to people who are involved in those churches. And there's times when I sit back and think, like, is this inevitable that you get a church so big and so high profile and so it kind of becomes part of like celebrity culture that it just leads to this end? And is there anyone that could withstand it anyways? Like, there's some real structural things that we need to think about. So with that, all that being said, we were watching there's another round of things that have kind of come up. The Marcel podcast, which we talked about a little bit
in the fall,
which they just did an update to it. Dealing with their own crap, which Aaron listened to. Yeah. Megan listened or watched the Discovery Plus documentary on Hillsong, the exposing a mega church
exposed. Yep.
Which, so I don't know. Do you guys want to kind of talk about what you kind of paid attention to, or what you watched, or in kind of your takeaways?
Yeah. So for me, similar to your experience, Mark, kind of coming out of a church situation where you definitely felt abused in probably several forms. Like I've had worked at several churches like that over the years, where I've experienced things like that have been extremely negative, hardships that have caused me to question, like, do I want to stay in ministry? I've never gotten to the point where I've like questioned my faith, but definitely questioned like being a leader within the church.
Yeah.
And for me, the other part of this too is like, over the years, I've experiencing these different situations and these traumas in church leadership. I've really felt this like growing sense of like, there's issues here, but I've never been able to like put my finger on the pulse or define it. And I feel like within the last year and a half, we've really been able to do that, because we have these really poignant examples of failures that really illustrate these bigger picture, high level issues, and not just those churches, but like all of Christianity.
Almost a reckoning for the Big C church.
Yeah.
Like, no longer can it be swept under a rug.
Right.
Yeah.
And also for me, the third thing is like, as a pastor, as a leader in church, leading, shepherding other people, discipling other Christians, like, I have been passionate about that the entire time I've been in ministry, but I've also grown this passion for the church itself, like all churches, because I sit here and I think like, it's so basic, but you would think the church would be the best representative of Christ to the world. And oftentimes we're not even the best representative of Christ to other Christians. Like, oftentimes we're one of the worst examples, because we, instead of drawing people closer to church and drawing people closer to God and closer to Jesus, we do things that push them farther away. And so all of these things in combination have stirred in me a need to like read and listen and watch and learn, not only for myself, but for Pursuit and for all churches. Like, so yes, that's kind of like where I'm at. And I know we all feel similar to that. So, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill is a podcast produced by Christianity Today, which is a magazine. They're a big media outlet in the Christian world. If you don't know who they are, you can check them out.
What's a magazine again?
It's all digital now.
Yeah.
It's something that old school Christians still read.
Layers of paper stuck together that you can kind of flip
very
instead of like
glossy.
swiping with a
They
finger.
kept printers in business for a long
Can I
time.
read that on my iPad or?
So they produced this podcast, and it's really telling in part the story of Mars Hill and Mark Driscoll and kind of the failing of that
In
Seattle, which was a huge mega church on the West Coast. But it also, in order to tell that story, it tells sort of the church history of the last 40 years and how mega churches kind of became a thing in the United States. And so, like, it's not only a story about Mars Hill and about Mars Driscoll, but I feel like it's a story about all churches, because it uses these examples. It talks about highballs. It talks about a lot of different things, and not just failures, but like tells the story of how we got from there to here.
I would say it focuses in on the different cultural movements within the church over the past 30 years, 40 years, I guess, all the way back to Crystal Cathedral or whatever. Right?
Yeah, like the
60s,
60s,
50s,
50s, 60s. Yeah.
So, but like the cultural movements within the church.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yep. So I highly recommend it. There, among Christian schools, there's different viewpoints on the motivations of that podcast and what they're trying to do.
Full disclosure, I could not finish it.
Mm-hmm.
Every time I listened to one, I lamented for like 3 days. It
breaks your heart.
hurt me deeply.
It
I
breaks
haven't
your heart.
finished it either.
I'm not saying it hurt me deeply in a way that wasn't fair.
Yeah.
It was absolutely fair.
Yeah.
It was a terrible situation
Mm-hmm.
that I think left a crater
Mhm.
for the kingdom in Seattle. I don't think we can quantify the damage that it did to the kingdom of God. And I think there's a lot of people who are like, no, it's great. Things are fine. And I think if you talk to anybody from Seattle who was there during that time, you'll find people that are very far from God because of that church and because of Driscoll. And at the time, I think I was in college, maybe early on in my ministry. I revered Driscoll. I thought he was just this macho, Jesus loving, tell it like it is.
Affliction t-shirt
Yeah.
wearing.
And now I look back and think, holy cow, it is.
Yeah.
How could we be so far away from what God intended?
Mhm.
Like what a,
Mhm.
so every time I listen to a podcast, I was like on my knees going, Jesus, please don't let this be me.
Mhm.
Like, don't let this be our church.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So it was hard for me to listen to. I think most people probably don't have my baggage. You know what I mean? Like, probably don't think about the church the way that I do.
Sure.
They could probably listen to it a little easier.
I think in an effort to be more self-aware about not only yourself as a Christian, but as a Christian who is in community with other Christians in the context of a church, it is a valuable effort of self-awareness.
I'm thankful they did it.
Yeah.
I'm
absolutely.
not against it. I think people should listen to it. It's
Yeah.
fine.
Absolutely.
I think for me, listening. Sorry, I'll let you continue in just a second.
It's all good.
She'll let you.
Listening to these stories
Yeah.
is awful, and I hate it. But it has been really important for me to see outside of the church a little bit and to take some of my own blinders off,
Mhm.
so that I can actually look. And I mean, this is a question that we ask on staff. Is there a thing we're missing? Is there a thing that we're excusing for the sake of the ministry right now?
Mhm.
Leaving space for something.
Right. Are
Right.
we,
Yeah.
is there a place where something could happen because we're focused somewhere else for the sake of the ministry? So this has been something for me that has been it's awful and you feel horrible.
Mhm.
There was one morning where on a Sunday we were getting ready. We were getting ready for church, setting up. And Mark, you were like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, yeah. Oh, I listened to the Mars Hill podcast on my way in this morning. I'm not in a good frame of mind right now. Give me a second. I gotta refocus
I
here.
couldn't listen to it on Mondays.
Yeah. I was like, well, Sunday morning on the way to church is not the time
Yep.
Yeah.
to listen to this. But it's been really
Mhm.
important for me to
Yeah.
just help think
And
about these
it was
things.
he was the icon of a macho form of Christianity
Mhm.
that was very much focused on legalism and coercion, control.
Yes. Control.
Also put women in their place, as far as he was concerned.
Yeah.
Hey, we're here for these men. We're here to transform the city by creating all of these like soldiers,
Mhm.
and who knew it was going to blow up, like coercion and control and
That's how I
legalism
feel.
and macho
Yeah, shocker.
nonsense.
It doesn't go well.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so check it out. I think it's really great for people to, even if it is uncomfortable for you, to jump into that and just wade through those waters. And you've got people here that will do it with you too. I mean, I love talking about this stuff. So they wrapped up the series back in December, and at the end of it, they said, like, as we've done this reporting and researching and interviews, talking to all these different people, we've kind of found all of these other conversations and topics that we want to talk about. So we'll have bonus episodes that we'll release. So they just had one drop this week on Monday, I think. That's when I listened to it. And basically, it was kind of an eye-opening episode because they're talking about themselves. Christianity Today, they had their own moral failing and sexual abuse allegation scandal within their own ranks. 2 former employees, one high level, like their CEO, and then another one, he was in the marketing department or something, not important. So basically, while they're producing this podcast, they're having their own scandal kind of come out, and they're having to deal with it.
Christianity Today.
Yeah. Christianity Today. And so basically this bonus episode is them reporting on themselves and their own scandal and talking about that. And it was really good. And one of the things I think that stuck out to me that I think is really important and rings true, not only for churches, but for all Christian institutions, magazines, media outlets, schools, colleges, is that in some ways we have drifted so far off course from the original mission of the church that in creating these institutions and mega churches and these things that we want to grow and get bigger, because that's a good thing, right? If you have a church, you should want it to get bigger, because that means more people coming to know Jesus. That as we do that, the very things that we have to set up to enable that growth are the very things that create a very fertile environment for abuse to happen. Because it's not about transparency, like you were saying, Megan. It's not about ethics. It's about growth. And that becomes the thing that can enable either an individual or an institution or a group of people to either enable abuse to happen or to cover it up and try and keep the engine running despite the trauma that's happened.
Yeah, I think there's a point where a church gets so big that people stop running it like a church and start running it like a business.
Mm-hmm.
And these 2 philosophies are very, very different.
Mm-hmm.
And if you start running a church like a business, then the business, the church, becomes the most important thing. And protecting the church so that it can do ministry.
Right.
I don't think it's always with ill intent in the beginning, but protecting the church so that it can do ministry, so that it can reach more people. It just leaves you open to making little concessions, and then little concessions become bigger concessions, and you withhold information so that you don't hurt people, but then that turns into a lie. And God cannot lie. The church cannot survive in the shadow, in the secret.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, we've talked about this many times. We strive to be a church that is 100% transparent and 100% open to any of your questions, to anything, because we know that this can't survive,
right,
if we're secretive and hushed up.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yeah, I was just thinking about too that line of thinking. That was Ravi Zacharias' big thing that he did. So Ravi Zacharias was a evangelist, had a worldwide ministry. If you look up YouTube clips of him, he's usually like talking some atheist into a corner, and just.
I mean, if you don't know who he is, he's one of the central figures for our generation of like teachers, speakers that was like extremely influential.
Yep.
And like, yeah,
and just defending the faith and all that. And it turns out he had all these inappropriate relationships with women, and the thing he would always say to them, apparently, this is what they did a whole report. You can actually go look up the report. RZIM, Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, posted the entire report online. They're finally at a place where they're ready to be transparent about stuff. that he would just say to people, hey, if you talk about this, it'll destroy the effect that God could have in the lives of millions of people, because there's so many people I get to affect in my ministry, and you will be taking
and this will be your fault.
Yeah, right. And you're just like, what the heck?
Hello,
like,
manipulation.
How can we get to that that place? And that's just like a unchecked ego. It turns out he had multiple phones. Turns out the board was, he had a slush fund that he could use for anything he wanted, and nobody on the board decided to question that. He would go on international trips to write his books, and he would take with him a masseuse who traveled with him, who was at one point, it looked like a sex slave, essentially, like a Thai woman who was just like being kept in an apartment that was like one floor down from his, like, just, things that were just despicable, right? And you read this and you're like, but like, this is the guy who was, defending the faith, like, to millions of people. He's the one that's arguing with atheists. He's the one that's, giving somebody who wants to defend their faith like plenty of ammunition to go and have an argument or conversation with somebody. And you're just like, what the world? But that's the thing. They go, if you say anything about this, or you bring this to light, or you bring this up, like, it's going to ruin the institution, the ministry, the fruit. And we've talked about the fact that they always point to the fruit to justify whatever it is that they're wanting to do. Well, look at all the people that are being saved, and you're just like, this is poison. Like, this fruit is not healthy. If it's coming out of this ministry who's operating like this, whose culture is like this, then this isn't going to lead to great.
Right. And we're talking about some really like high level leaders, Christian celebrities who have had major failings that we read about, that we listen to. There are churches in the Twin Cities that are doing these same things. Maybe not sexual stuff that we know of, but like, there are churches that are justifying abuse for the fruit. It's happening right here.
It's the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah. There's a very famous pastor in the Twin Cities who just left his church over some of these allegations, and then just planted another one. And it's like, now the church is hundreds of thousands of people again, and people are just right back on the train. And it turns out like the allegations are pretty heinous, and no one seemed to care, So like, this is the kind of stuff that, I wouldn't want to call that one out by name. It's like down the road, but it's, this kind of stuff, I think before social media existed, this stuff could kind of be swept under the rug.
I think it was easier to hide.
You'd have a elder board that was like, felt like they were doing good. They're trying to protect the pastor. They're trying to protect the ministry. They're trying to protect the organization. They have, these boards are lay people who have no experience in how to handle a crisis like this. Talking about our own governance, one of the things, I think we've talked about this once or twice, but like, one of the things we have in there is that if there's some sort of like allegation, it goes to an outside organization immediately. It gets out of the hands of our elders, whatever our leadership team looks like, it's going to be out of their hands and on to another level.
There's no like, we review it, see if it's credible, and then pass it on.
Nope.
That's crap.
We review it in our denomination. So we send it up the stream to our
Somebody
denomination.
Somebody else can review it.
Or to an independent outside organization, and we let them decide if it's credible or whatever, and then we transparently share all the information. That's the goal. We didn't have to have this in our, well, maybe we did, but like, these weren't, I went looking for this language in other people's constitutions for churches, and I can't find any constitutions that are written in a way that has this language in it, because we're finally at a place where we have to take this seriously. And I feel bad for these teams of elders, because they're not qualified. Like, I wonder about legal immunity. Like, why hasn't some of this fallen onto these elder teams who covered up stuff? I almost wonder, like, is there a legal problem by having a group of lay people make a decision to, like, either go after something or put something away? It almost should be like, whoa, for legal purposes, you need to have an outside organization come in and review this. Otherwise, you might personally be liable for damages or whatever. So I don't know. It's whatever. So that was Christianity Today, exposing their own stuff, which is good for them.
Yeah. If you're going to point it out in anybody else, you better be willing to turn the finger on yourself.
And it was a little bit more easy for them, because it was like, it happened in the past. The staff had all turned over. There's nobody left from that
Yeah,
regime.
the CEO guy named Mark Alley, he had retired,
Right.
which everyone, at the time, they're like, "Oh, he's retiring. See ya."
Mhm.
Turns out, like, the timing of it probably was very coincidental with a lot of these things that were going on behind the scenes.
Mhm.
But like one of the things they talk about in the interview is, they say that one of the hard things as an organization like CT is, you know, there aren't any of these people on staff anymore.
Right.
Like even the HR people that dropped the ball and didn't do things right,
Mhm.
they're not even there. So it's like we're left as an organization. It's not our fault, but it's definitely our problem. Like
Mhm.
we're not. There's no one to punish. There's no one to like fire. There's no one to reprimand. So it's like that's part of their transparency is not only in an effort to like just be like, hey, this happened and we're handling it the best we can, but I think they didn't say this, but I think they're trying to be an example.
Yep.
Do what other churches like Willow Creek and Mars Hill should have done at the time,
Right.
but they
Mhm.
didn't. So it's good. So I'd recommend not only the entire podcast, but listening to that because I think it's a good thought exercise and just self-awareness as a Christian. And you're part of the church, whether you want to admit that or not. Megan, you watched the Hillsong.
I did. It was really hard.
I'm not sure I want to watch. I mean, I probably need to.
Yeah.
But
It's 3 episodes. They're each about an hour long. It's on Discovery Plus. I almost said Disney Plus. Different network.
Animation exposed.
No, if you don't know, Hillsong is a church that started in Australia. It started as a relatively small church that then realized they could use marketing and whatnot and look like the culture to bring culture in more.
Mhm.
And they got very big. I guarantee if you have listened to any worship music, you have heard their music, and they're now in like 30 countries. I don't know how many churches, but they're massive. But this docuseries just goes through the there's so many things. The founding pastor, it has now come out that there were sexual abuse allegations against him, a giant cover up from his son, who was then the pastor and the board. Um, Everything that happened in New York with Carl Lentz, who was the pastor of
New York City.
Hillsong, New York.
Also married to the daughter of the guy who started the original Hillsong Church, which is sort of important.
So, like in the family, there's a Hillsong College that is doing all sorts of crazy things. To go to this college, Aaron, I don't know if you know this, you have to sign an NDA. You're not allowed to tell your family about what's going on at school.
Yeah.
Bananas. Like, can we talk about the biggest red flag?
There are
NDA.
A non-disclosure
Yeah.
agreement.
Yeah. Hey, I got some paperwork I need you guys to sign.
Yeah, and there are so
later.
many students that they interviewed that they were like, I didn't even know I signed this. Like, I signed a
Right.
lot of things. And it's like,
Should we sign FDA's full disclosure agreement?
I worked at a church where that happens. I
Yeah.
didn't have to sign one, but it happens.
it hurts my heart. And so they looked into this docuseries looks into Carl Lentz, and the church that he worked at before he was at Hillsong, and there was a ton of manipulation.
He was well known as like a celebrity pastor. He
Yeah.
was tight with Bieber
Yeah.
and Kevin Durant.
Yeah.
And super slick.
Yeah. Very charismatic, very attractional to the youth and young demographics of New York, and would pack out Irving Plaza, right? Did I get that right?
I've been there one time.
That's the name of it though, right?
I don't remember.
Okay. I think it's Irving Plaza. And they said that people would line up around the block. There would be a line 2 blocks long an hour before the service.
Yeah.
And
That's true.
you might not get in depending on how many celebrities showed up that week.
Yep.
Like, I don't know about you guys.
There was a
I have
section
no
that was like
desire.
there was a section blocked off.
Yeah.
So
And it
like,
just kept getting bigger and bigger.
Well, like celebrities could basically come and not be bothered by anyone and then worship.
Yeah.
Like I kind of understood the like thought process behind it because I can think of being a celebrity, you wouldn't even want to go to church.
Yeah.
You just have too many people want to like.
Yeah.
It'd be way
Like a
about
security
you.
risk.
Yeah, I do think maybe some of them were like authentically happy to have a place to worship like where they could just show up and
Mhm.
be normal.
But yeah, the like, ugh, gross.
I got to start that 7-day trial.
Yeah. So Houston, there's a couple of allegations against him specifically, but the big thing,
against Brian Houston.
yes,
There are
there's-
2 Houstons.
yes. So his dad, the big thing was his dad had like an inappropriate relationship with a young boy.
With like, there's like 8
Okay,
at this point that have
multiple.
come forward.
So
Between
like
the like
pedophilia.
50s and 70s.
Yep.
Um,
And then somebody came forward and shared the information with Hillsong.
yes.
And it was Brian who had to report on his dad, and they chose not
Well,
to.
it got reported to Frank and the leadership at the time first. It was kind of covered
I
up
love how we're
and
using
hushed up.
first names. Frank's the guy. who-
Frank Houston.
No
see,
relation
I didn't
to
even know.
Whit-
Yeah, okay, I got you.
No
dad.
relation to Whitney.
Yes,
by
the
way.
dad.
Gotcha.
The original
Whitney.
founder of
Yeah.
Hillsong,
Right.
original pastor. They kind of covered it up. A $10,000 check was written that was
Ugh.
agreed upon at McDonald's, written out on a napkin to give you some sort of scope of like how much Hillsong didn't
They're just
care
trying to buy this person off.
about this. Yes.
Yeah.
And then authorities got involved, Parliament in Australia got involved, and finally they started doing investigations, found out Brian Houston knew,
Right.
leadership at Hillsong knew.
And that's massively illegal in Australia to
It's
not.
yes, it's illegal to not report a crime if you knew it
Yes.
happened.
Here we're mandated reporters. If we don't report a crime, it could be like a slap on the wrist.
Yep.
A lot of times, like it's not going to be something like.
Depends. Yeah, it depends.
I mean, probably
I think Minnesota has some of the strongest mandated reporting laws.
right.
The thing I don't know is like how deep those teeth can sink in.
Yeah,
legally.
I mean, we
Like,
would. We
Yeah.
always would. We talk
Yes.
about it as a staff. We talk about it. We're all
Absolutely.
mandated reporters.
Yep.
Anybody who's going to be on our elder team, whatever leadership team, they're all going to be mandated reporters. Like that's the way we roll. All teachers are mandated reporters.
Yeah.
all coaches and
Yeah.
Anyone who
Anybody
works with
kids.
youth.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
And basically the legal standing there is that the state of Minnesota wants to incentivize people to like tell the truth when
Yep.
they see something,
Right.
an abuse happen to a minor, basically.
So they've uncovered a ton of documentation from Hillsong that they had these meetings, they talked about it, they knew about it, they hushed it up and did nothing.
Right.
And now there are allegations against Brian Houston, the son. And it's just like he is actually in court proceedings now because Australia has come back and been like, you didn't do anything. You didn't report this.
Right.
You were supposed to. You're legally obligated to report this. And kind of his stance is, well, when the allegations came to light, this individual was now an adult.
Mhm.
So the reporting should have been on him. It was no longer my requirement to report
Mhm.
anything, which is just
Yeah.
layers and layers of poop.
One of
Tell us how you really feel, Megan.
one of the lessons here is like don't mess around with Australia, man. Like they're pretty hard nosed on this stuff. I mean, they wouldn't even let Novak
Djokovic
play because he lied about his vaccination status. Like,
Yeah.
let alone lying about knowing about an
but
abuse
one
that
of
happens to a minor. Like,
one of the patterns that they have kind of uncovered was that Frank Houston, the original church planner,
the OG.
had issues in New Zealand
OG pedophile.
where he's
Yeah.
from.
Yeah.
Like there were
Oh.
allegations from New Zealand when things started getting hot there.
right
He moved to Australia.
before social media.
Right. Before media, before this could really go big, go global,
Mhm.
he just moved, started a new church.
Did it again.
How many times have we seen that happen? And now even Hillsong, they've said things have kind of died down. They're not as ramped up in Australia to like planting more campuses and like building there. They've switched focuses to globally. And now a lot of churches are just becoming their own thing, all under the Hillsong name, but not necessarily
So there's been a lot of
legally.
American Hillsong churches. There's Georgia, Phoenix, New York City. A couple of them left the Hillsong
Mhm.
organization and were able to just walk away.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think there's been some
Mhm.
like some decoupling
Yeah.
in
But
some of those.
I wonder, is that because they actually are like, that's awful, what you guys are doing is bad and we want to step away from that? Or is that legally we don't want to associate with you, so we're going to cut ties because that could be harmful for us? But in reality, we were born out of the same thing. The culture is still the same. We're going to
Mhm.
continue to do the same things. We're just not legally going to be associated with you.
Yeah.
So
Unfortunately, some of that stuff is probably like TBD.
I mean, you don't
know?
know, but that's the right thing to do.
yeah.
Yeah.
No,
Right.
I'm not saying
You
it's
distance
not.
yourself and you go, that's
It just
sin,
can't. It
it's
can't
wrong.
stop there.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Like you have to keep.
Sure.
You have to dig into culture there. In this documentary, one of the things that I thought was really interesting, they interviewed I think he was an abuse advocate, who said that oftentimes it is more painful and more detrimental to the victim. What is more detrimental is not the abuse that happened, but the way the church responds to it.
Right.
And
Yeah.
the like denial and shunning and like cover up. That's more painful, more detrimental, takes longer to process through and get over than the
It's the
instance
same
of
thing we
abuse.
tell our kids when they're caught.
Yeah.
Tell the truth.
Yep.
If you don't tell the truth, it's going to be worse.
You're not in trouble because you did it. You're in trouble because you lied to me.
It's going to be worse, right?
Yep.
And it's almost like when they do the like secondary, they try to minimize it, cover it up.
Well, yeah, because then you have to lie again to cover for that first lie.
Right.
And it just snowballs.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's even more sinister than that. I mean, in the Mars Hill podcast, I think it's the first or second episode, they have an abuse counselor, religious abuse counselor on, and I'm butchering the quote, but she basically says like, what makes abuse at the hands of a church leader or of a church so bad is that, as if abuse isn't bad enough, whatever form it takes.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Like the fact that it's done by the hands of a Christian leader, a pastor, someone within the church, a church
Yep.
representative, it essentially puts God on the side of the abuser. And it's basically saying God's endorsing this abuse. So it creates this spiritual crisis internally within the
Yeah.
individual where they can't even go to God in their time of need.
Yep.
And she says, her quote is, she's been doing this for decades. And she's like, there are no words to describe the damage that is done to a human soul when that happens. And that's what that's what it comes down to. Like
any power dynamic.
Yep.
There's another level of abuse that happens. It's when it's
Yep.
a boss, when it's a pastor, when, and
in
again,
the biz, we call it a power differential.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this is even worse when it's someone who
Yep.
potentially represents God to you.
Yeah.
And
Like
this is what's happening now with the Meeting House. The Meeting House is a Anabaptist church in Ontario, Canada. Relatively big, well-known church that had allegations come out in December of last year against their senior pastor.
Well known because Danielle Strickland,
Yep.
who's a speaker and author, somebody who's amazing,
Social justice advocate, yeah.
Works at that church.
She used to, yes.
Yeah,
She was on
right.
she was on staff as their teaching
And
team.
she's somebody that we have read, listened to at conferences.
Yep.
Like inspirational person. Like
Yeah.
like did street ministry with
Mhm.
like in Canada, like just
Mhm.
I like to think of her as like a connections pastor.
she's
That's
incredible. Like she's I don't know.
I
She
don't-
has a million stories about like
I've never seen pastor is not necessarily a word she uses
Mhm.
to describe herself first. It's always like advocate, things
Yeah.
like that. And then somewhere down the list of 15 titles, pastor comes in. But abuse was, and I think she's central to this because she was the person who it was first reported to. The victim first spoke with Danielle. And so in December, and then we were taking a class in February that she was one of the speakers for, and we did a Zoom meeting. And somebody asked her about it, and she was like, obviously I can't say a lot, but I'll say two things. One, I've been really proud of the Meeting House and how they've responded to this, taken this seriously, and called in outside review. And two, I will do everything I can to stand with the victim and make sure her voice is heard. Fast forward a couple months, in early March, she announced that she was resigning from her teaching post at the Meeting House. because of how things were being handled with this victim. The next day, Bruxy, who was the lead pastor at the meeting house, put out his official statement and basically said, I had an extramarital affair years ago. I should have told you about it. It was wrong. I shouldn't have put my wife through this. I shouldn't have put the church through this. And I'm sorry. He apologized, but then the meeting house that same day comes out with their statement that I'm actually going to read it. The investigators' work is now complete. This is just a portion of it, and this is on the meeting house's website. Over the last number of days, the overseers have read the report, and we have taken time to process the information and consider the required actions. The investigator determined that Bruxy had maintained a sexual relationship with the victim, an adult woman, in violation of the meeting house policy and the Handbook of Faith and Life to be in Christ Church
very clear
of
to
Canada.
say adult woman.
Yep. The investigator also found that what became a sexual relationship between Bruxy and the victim, which lasted over an extended period of time, constituted an abuse of Bruxy's power and authority as a member of the clergy and amounted to sexual harassment. And then they basically asked him to step down. He submitted his resignation and they accepted it. But what Danielle has said is that's not strong enough language. And you went just past he had an affair. What they don't get into is this victim is half of his age. This relationship started as a counseling relationship because the victim was in crisis and was looking for help and guidance from her pastor. This is the power differential.
Right.
There have been so many comments online of didn't he just have an affair? Why is this such a big thing? And it's because
as if that's not bad
right,
enough. Yeah.
They go out of their way to say adult, and I'm like, that means it's probably a very young person.
Yeah.
And let's just be honest. Is it just an extramarital affair when you are a counselor and a pastor? You can't call it that.
Yeah.
That's sexual abuse.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is abuse.
When a power dynamic is involved, sexual abuse.
Yes.
Right.
And so this has been kind of the center of, and now, okay, so remember this was first reported in December, and then report came out in March, on March 8th. March 12th, the meeting house finally brings in a victim advocate.
Right.
Not in December.
3 months after.
The first, and this was one of the problems that Danielle said was,
Right.
You're not giving her any support.
Right.
Sure.
She is out here on her own, having to advocate for herself.
Mm-hmm.
How many years ago was it? Did they say? Let's say it was a while. I think people think it's less important or intense when time has passed, But it's that just tells you how long it took that person to get the courage to go ahead.
I don't know exactly. I don't remember.
It's fine.
Danielle she did a Instagram live in March when we were in Orlando that goes into, I think, a little bit more detail. But it was March 12th that they finally were like, okay, we need to bring in a victim advocate. And then March 19th, so just a few days later, they announced that 2 more victims had come forward.
Yeah.
And it's just, it hurts my heart that we can go from, okay, you responded well. You didn't respond how other churches have and hushed it up. You brought in somebody else from the outside. You started off well. And then you, Danielle's words are, they continued to kind of downgrade and use the least serious language that they could get away with to be semi-transparent, but not these are things that we need to call them what they are.
Yeah.
Sexual abuse is not a moral failing.
Right.
Those,
it's not a consensual relationship.
No, moral failing is you lied on your taxes or some sexual abuse. That's a criminal act.
Right.
Yeah.
That's so let's call it what it is. I know that we want to find the silver lining here, but
yeah,
and see the good out of the bad, but we just have to call out the bad.
No, it's fruit. Like, oh, look how many people this
Yeah.
person affected.
Yeah,
over
like
their
it's
life.
this all
You're
over
like,
again.
yeah, but like,
And it's
sorry, this is one of those jobs where you don't
Yeah.
get second chance after you make one
Yeah.
of these mistakes. Like,
Yep. You're done.
now just
There
go
are no
sell some
3
insurance,
strikes.
you know?
Yeah. So I think for the sake of time here, like kind of where I'm at, I'm sure you guys are in the same spot, is, and it's even like how we started this half of the conversation on this podcast, is we want to update you guys. But you might be listening to this saying like, okay, so what's the point besides just reporting on the latest wave of scandals and different things, we're not just talking about these things to like, tantalize you. And, if you're already down this path of disgruntledness with the church and frustration with mega churches and celebrity pastors, we're not just trying to like fan the flames and make them larger. We're doing this because I think it's important to keep this conversation going, like to keep it going for all of us in our own way, not to just deconstruct faith, but to just be more self-aware of these systemic issues, the not only institutions, but the dysfunctions. Be aware of it, embrace the bad with the good, and be able to say collectively as the body of Christ, we have not done this right. And we need to be better. And that's really what the whole point of this is.
And Danielle, the last podcast she did, I can't remember the name of it, but it's just the last one she did. She talks about how this is actually spiritual warfare. Like this isn't just like human sin. Like there's so much more to this. And we imagine spiritual warfare as just like happening in this realm that we don't really see. And there's some sort of war going on, but we don't really understand. But that there's more to this, and what we can focus on, like the coming out of this, is focus on truth and light, because these are the two things that God is, and God cannot lie. So as a church, we need to embody him, and we're gonna live above board. We're gonna be transparent. I would also say, don't listen to or watch any of this on your own and just like sit with it. You will want to crawl in a hole.
We pretty
and
much
just like tuck your head in the sand.
We have conversations staff-wise every Tuesday about this kind of stuff.
Have a conversation with
this stuff,
somebody
right.
like as you're digging through this. Like come and talk to one of us or with your small group or something, so that you're not just like piling on all the stress. And
I'm not entirely to this position yet, but I feel like I'm moving in a direction where I would rather see the institution of the church not exist if it meant abuse would stop. Like, we can't keep existing as an institution if we're going to continue allowing abuse to happen in any form.
Yeah, I think that's certainly an extreme position.
It is.
From coming from the king of hyperbole right here. I think where I'm at is I'm ready to root it all out.
Yeah.
Like let's just continue to root it all out.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
it's an extreme way of saying.
I want to get to the other side of it, where churches now operate differently because of what we've figured out during this time period. Yeah, and it is just designed to be safer. It's designed to protect us from narcissists. It's designed to
represent Jesus.
Yes, that's where I'm at.
So I have one last thing I want to share. And this,
by the way, this might be part one, because I think I would love in another time to talk about ways to avoid these kinds of situations.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Like institutionally.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And if there's any topic that we want to have engagement with you all on, it's this. Like, we want to hear from you all, like your versions of this, your experiences, where you're at with this stuff. Because that's important too. It's not just staff driven. It's not just leadership driven. It's all of us, because we're all part of the body of Christ equally. I watched a documentary this week, not about church failings.
Jesus music.
Jesus music.
Me and Gabe need to get together and watch this. We're both big fans of CCM from the 90s.
Yeah. So it's on Hulu. It's a documentary about contemporary Christian music. And it kind of goes all the way back to like the 60s and talks about like where it started, where it came from, and how all these different bands came up and influenced each other and all this stuff. It's really good. So at one point in the documentary, it's Michael W. Smith talking about his return to worship. And he quotes a passage out of Amos chapter 5. And I had read that before, but I'd never read the Message version of it. So I'm going to read that to you guys now. So it's Amos 5, verses 21 through 24 out of the Message. And it says this. This is God speaking. I can't stand your religious meetings. I'm fed up with your conferences and your conventions. I want nothing to do with your religion projects, your pretentious slogans and goals. I'm sick of your fundraising schemes, your public relations and image making. I've had all I can take of your noisy ego music. When was the last time you sang to me? Do you know what I want? I want justice, oceans of it. I want fairness, rivers of it. That's what I want. That's all that I want. So that's a pretty cutting verse. It's very direct in like modern terms about what a lot of churches are about and what a lot of churches do with their outputs. And it should sting. It should cut. But I want to focus on those last 4 lines. Do you know what I want? I want justice. I want fairness. That's what I want. That's all I want. And so if there's anything that should motivate us, it should not be focusing on the failures. Those should motivate us to be better. But that's what should drive us in this. It should be to get back to the heart of worship.
Oh, jeez.
Just
I love
kidding.
you. I love it.
It should be to get back to like what God desires,
Right.
what glorifies him.
Yep.
And as we're talking about all of these failings, all of these abuses, it's the opposite of that. It's not about justice. It's not
Mhm.
about fairness. It's not what God wants.
Right.
And so as the
It's
body
about
of Christ,
abuse. It's about control.
right.
It's about ego. It's about power.
Image.
It's about,
Yeah.
it's none of the things.
So
that-
we should be more concerned about what God wants
Yep.
and less concerned about what culture around us wants or what an ego-driven pastor or leader or teacher or author wants, a celebrity person. We should be the first and only filter should be, are we honoring God? Is it about justice and fairness? Are we doing what God
Mhm.
desires? So
I want to pray.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Let that be true about our church, Jesus, that you would be held higher than anything else, that we would keep our egos in check, that this would not become about us. It would be continually about you, about raising you up, about reaching people in your name, about building your kingdom. God, we pray that this church would always honor you, that it would be everything that we put out would be a sweet fragrance that you are pleased with, that it would be an offering. God, I pray that you keep all of these things in check, that we live in this transparent world where we share this with the people that go to this church, where we are the kind of church that we miss in this community if we didn't exist. God, that we keep our eyes on what is most important. In Jesus' name, amen.
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 All right. It was like one of my sermons, 1 hour, 23 minutes.
Zing.
I mean, I might as well make the joke
Yeah.
as one of you guys would.
I
beat me
would
to it.
never.
Hey, we love you guys. We hope you have a good week. And we covet your thoughts and your questions and your opinions. So be sure to send those to us, not only in the chat, but you can talk to any of us on a Sunday. Shoot us an email. If you have our phone numbers, you can text us as well. We'd love to hear from you. We'll be back next week.
All right. Cool.